Hi, guys. This is The Archive, a show about history, politics, and literature. The purpose of this show is to have conversations that deepen our shared understanding of our common situation. And today we are talking to Professor Zehyoue about Walter Rodney's seminal work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Professor,
Hey, it's nice to see you.
thanks for coming on the show.
I'm so happy to be here.
Friend of the show, have previously been on the show.
I like that. I like that category, friend of the show. I'm
Can
gonna add it to
you
my handle.
can you introduce yourself for the people at home?
Sure. Hi, my name is Professor Elijah Zehyoue. I am a historian of Africa and the African diaspora. My work primarily focuses on 20th century African and African diasporic political history. Um, um, do a lot of work on Liberia, but not exclusively Liberia, African nationalism, and civil rights and Black Power in the U.S. So very much so interested in the cross Atlantic conversation of Black folk.
Which makes you a perfect intellectual to have this conversation with on Walter Rodney's work. Could you just tell us a little bit about your relationship to this text, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, the first time that you read it, the way that it changed maybe your worldview or political orientation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is absolutely my favorite book. I think this is probably the most important history book ever written. And I think it's the most important book to understand Africa, to understand the modern world, to understand the relationship between Africa and the Western world. I was introduced to this book as an undergraduate at Morehouse College. My professors in my African history class had us read it. And I remember the first time I worked through it, I was really trying to grasp so many of the ideas in there. I didn't fully get it, but by the end and after having to reread it a number of times, I would say it really opened my eyes to the power of critical history, the power of critical discourse, and it really opened my eyes to, um, you know, why movements for African and Black self determination were so important. And I have been really in a lifelong conversation with this book, with the ideas in the book. And even though I never got to meet Walter Rodney myself, he died before I was born. I feel like I'm in a conversation with Walter Rodney as well.
100%. And could you tell us a little bit about who Walter Rodney was and the historical context of when this book was written?
Absolutely. It's a brilliant question. So, Walter Anthony Rodney was born in British Guyana in 1942. And at the time that he was born, as the name connotes, his country of Guyana, now an independent country, was still under British influence. He was educated at the University of the West Indies. Was a brilliant student by all accounts. And then for his postgraduate, he went on to the University of London to study for his PhD there. His first book based on his dissertation was A History of the Upper Guinea Coast. And in that work, he was doing really significant archival research to show the connection of the people of West Africa, so modern day Senegal, modern day Gambia, modern day Guinea, modern day Sierra Leone, and modern day Liberia, who's doing significant work to show how before the colonial and national histories of those places developed, there was a political integration, a cultural integration, and an economic exchange of that region, and that played a significant role in what would later help to inform his own political thought, his own political consciousness. When this book was written. Walter Rodney was living in Tanzania. He had been invited by Julius Nyerere, who was the president of Tanzania, who helped to lead the anti-colonial movement in Tanzania. And really, he was invited there by Nyerere to observe, to witness, and to advise on African decolonization. And so this book was really written during the period of decolonization, and it was written to help African nationalists at the time understand what they needed to know about the world to more properly decolonize. And you know, this book about Africa was written in the heart of Africa at a very critical time in African history. Something for us to keep in mind is that where we sit today, we're 60 years removed from the decolonization of Africa. And one of the things that can happen is we can miss the real critical juncture that leaders like Nyerere, leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, really found themselves in as they were stepping into the mantle of leadership and trying to figure out which direction Africa should go. And Walter Rodney, as an intellectual, as a historian, as a theorist, as an activist himself, was a critical part of that.
Mm-hmm. And what was the reception like to this book amongst Walter Rodney's fellow intellectuals, amongst people in the West and on the African continent?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, in terms of the African reception, it was huge. I mean, this was a part of a broader movement by African intellectuals and African activists to write African history from the perspective of Africans. And I say from the perspective of Africans, because Walter Rodney, Eric Williams, C.L.R. James, all of these Caribbean intellectuals consider themselves to be a part of the African nationalist movement because their identity as African descendant people in the Caribbean was deeply shaped by this world that Walter Rodney is talking about in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And so this text was a part of that intellectual genealogy that was emerging around the same time. UNESCO, in cooperation with the Organization for African Unity, will produce a general history of Africa. Over 15 volumes of African history from the beginning of time to eventually the colonial era, which sort of shaped our understanding of what Africans contributed to the making of their own world. And so this book was a part of that, and it was a welcome part of that. Now, at the same time, because of the critical thesis of the book, that Africa's so-called lack of underdevelopment had to be understood in terms of a dialectical relationship with Europe's development, this was a problem in the West. It was a problem in the era of the Cold War, and it was a problem. How do I put it? Because Rodney was saying very, very clearly that Africa is not fundamentally responsible for the conditions that it has found itself in, and so to the people that he was accusing, or maybe not accusing, but the people that he was, being really
accountable.
Holding accountable, mm-hmm. being really critical of. This was a major challenge for them.
Mm-hmm. And in that same vein, I know that Rodney faced certain levels of political persecution in his life. In the preface of this book, they talk about how Rodney had academic opportunities taken from him, I believe, when he went back to Guyana, and he was, it seemed, kicked out of Jamaica for organizing there. And I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what the reasons were for those political persecutions on the behalf of communities that should perhaps have been in solidarity with the work that Rodney was trying to do?
Yeah, this is a really excellent question. And again, we have to go back to what you asked earlier about the political context that shaped the writing of this book and that also shaped Rodney's scholar activism. So, while Africa was decolonizing, one of the things that was happening was that there was a shift in the global order, and the United States was becoming an even more significant global power. This is a major aspect of the Cold War. Um, and a part of what that meant from the perspective of the United States is that the United States was very interested in controlling the African movements for liberation and other movements for liberation around the world, especially black movements. And so we have African decolonization. We have a lot of activism happening in the Caribbean. And also we have the civil rights and black power movements happening here in the U.S. around that same time. And so, had Rodney just written this book and, stayed in Tanzania or even came to the United States and sort of was sort of just a historian, I don't know that he would have been persecuted in the same way. But Rodney really, really believed that his vocation as a historian was to lead movements that transform people. And so he didn't want to sort of just stay in the classroom, but he was interested in how power was organized, how it was orchestrated, and really he was a black power thinker and a black power strategist. And so by the time he goes back to the University of the West Indies, where he had gotten his education, he is seen not just as an intellectual, but as a radical activist, leftist, Marxist, a political figure. And at that time, during the Cold War, Jamaica was highly influenced by U.S. foreign policy, and Jamaica was under a lot of pressure to distance themselves from controversial figures like Rodney, like Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael, and the Caribbean in many ways. And this often gets left out of the history, but the Caribbean in many ways was sort of one of the most significant battlegrounds for U.S. and Western influence, and one of the significant sort of battlegrounds for black power politics. And there's a lot of really good scholars who are digging up that work right now about the black power movement in the Caribbean and how the black power movement in the Caribbean connected to the movements for African liberation on the continent and the black power movement here in the U.S. And so the Manley government in Jamaica was cognizant of that, cognizant of a perceived threat that they think Rodney posed, and they didn't want to give him the academic platform to do his political work, even though he was one of our most brilliant historians, and in my opinion, was a brilliant political activist as well.
And very principled. I think it's interesting that in the preface they also mentioned that he was very well aware that he was being persecuted politically, and it seems like his friends and family were trying to get him to leave Guyana. They were like, it's not safe for you here, you are going to be killed. And he himself seemed to acknowledge that in some way he had the potential of being a martyr, although I think he rejects that term. He was willing to do that in order to stay true to the ideals and the beliefs that he had, which I just think is something worth noting. I wanted to end on the Rodney section just by looking at the Marxist influence in this book and in Rodney's thinking at large. This book has a lot of I guess you could call them Marxist techniques that he uses to analyze through history. For example, when he's talking about the era of pre-colonial West Africa, he talks about the idea of the superstructure, and he talks about how certain conditions need to be met for a population or a society to advance through different stages. So I was just wondering, when talking about the kind of pedagogy of this book and the way that he's approaching history, if you could tell us a little bit about that Marxist influence and how that affects his orientation of African history.
Yeah, well. This is a really key point, and it's really key to understanding Rodney and to understanding, I would say, African history and an Africanist perspective of history. One of the things we have to do is to take a step back, right? Because in our country, especially today, right, Marxism has this sort of particular brand, and the overwhelming majority of the people who are even talking about the brand don't even understand the complexities, the differences between a sort of political Marxism and a historical Marxism, right? And Rodney has both, but Rodney was trained as a historian in England at a time when the Marxist analysis of history was the primary way of thinking about historical processes. And again, because we are so far removed from it, many in this country think that this is a new thing. No, some of the most significant global historians have thought about the development of world history through this lens, and this is the milieu that Rodney was trained in. This happens, at the same time when many parts of Europe, many parts of Asia, many parts of Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean were seriously considering, leftist politics, seriously engaging with leftist politics. This is a part of what intensified the Cold War. It wasn't that, this didn't seem to be a good option to people. It was an option that a lot of countries were seriously engaging with. And so Rodney trained as both a historian, with this tool of analysis, and someone living in a political moment when this was a really compelling, attractive option. No doubt influences how and why he writes this book. And one of the main things I would say to know about the Marxist relationship to the discipline of history is that it's trying to help us understand change over time, and it's trying to help us understand, well, at the base level, what's the primary driving force here? In his first chapter on 4 centuries of the European slave trade, right? He's trying to answer the question, well, how could people do this? And one of the things that has been missed in simply moral discourse, right, is that, it was simply just like bad people, evil people, cruelty. All those things were true. It was predicated on that. But what motivated the organization of this system? Well, the Marxist tool of analysis says, well, we have to understand the development of capital and the later the development of capitalism, and how that profit motive, which was gained from 4 centuries of slave trading, also then helped to sustain it and produce it. And then later it would become inconsequential and new systems will emerge. And so this frame of thinking helps us to really understand historical processes. And this is why we have to continue to engage with it. And this is why someone like Rodney certainly engaged with that frame of reference. And I think that's one of the major contributions that he, among other scholars, made this. Eric Williams, who preceded him and would later become the first Prime Minister of Trinidad. This was his argument in Capitalism and Slavery, to talk about the relationship between the two. And again, to do history, especially in the mid 19th and 20th century, was to engage with the Marxist tool of analysis.
Absolutely. And I wanted to use that, kind of as a jumping off point to get into the first chapter of the book, which talks about, some questions on underdevelopment, and also elaborate on what is kind of the thesis of the book. I wanted to quote in Rodney's own words what I think is the most important paragraph to read if you're not going to read the rest of the book. And it follows: the question as to who and what is responsible for African underdevelopment can be answered at two levels. Firstly, the answer is that the operation of the imperialist system bears major responsibility for African economic retardation by draining African wealth and making it impossible to develop more rapidly the resources of the continent. Secondly, one has to deal with those who manipulated the system and those who are either agents or unwitting accomplices of said system. The capitalists of Western Europe were the ones who actively extended their exploitation from inside Europe to cover the whole of Africa. In recent times, they were joined, and to some extent replaced, by the capitalists from the United States. And for many years now, even the workers of those metropolitan countries have benefited from the exploitation and underdevelopment of Africa. And so I wanted to start with a kind of big question of if you could elaborate on what Rodney means when he says underdevelopment, and in what way capitalism contributed to the so-called underdevelopment of Africa.
Oh wow, yeah. I mean, I absolutely agree with you that is the heart of the work, and I think that very simply summarizes what Rodney is getting at in this text. So I applaud you for drawing our attention to it. Again, when Rodney was writing this in the late 1960s, early 1970s, most African countries had been independent for about 10 years. And within that short period of time, there was this critique to say, all right, Africans have pushed for self-governance, self-determination. You have it. And after a decade or so of having it, what do you have to show for it? There's bad governance. There's poverty. And all of this was lumped in together under the category of underdevelopment. And I would argue to support the idea that Africans really were not ready for self-determination. I mean, again, think back to 1945, when the U.S., Britain, France, they're sort of reorganizing the world. They're rebuilding after the Second World War, and the question of African self-determination is put on the table. France takes the lead and said, look, these people aren't ready for it. They need to be under our tutorial for self-governance until they are ready. So if this is an attitude in 1945, it doesn't go away by 1960. There are geopolitical factors that push to make it happen, but there's still an idea in many Western governments that the African is incapable of governing herself. And so this question of underdevelopment is a part of that question. If Africans were capable of governing themselves, shouldn't their countries be functioning better by this time? And Rodney's saying, well, to ask that question is to overlook the historical process that got us here. And so for him, underdevelopment had to be complicated and had to say that, look, it's not just about sort of the poverty that you may see on the surface, but it's the structure that puts this poverty into place. And what Rodney says, underdevelopment then is an intentional act. It's a historical act. It's the 4 centuries of looting from African peoples, taking African resources, exploiting African land and African labor. And he says that is the development, and no amount of, quote, development can actually solve that problem unless we deal with this global structure that keeps that in place. And so He's really fighting with those who want to place uh, African problems on African peoples solely. Not to say that Africans don't bear some responsibility. He says often in the book that Africans do, but he says that our knowledge of the past should help us understand how we got the contemporary Africa. And if there is underdevelopment is in a dialectical relationship to overdevelopment or the overdevelopment of Europe, the transfer really of wealth from one part of the world to the other.
Absolutely. And I think that if you wanted to kind of discuss Rodney's argument in layman's terms, what he's really kind of addressing in the book is, why is Africa today the way that it is?
Yeah.
Simply put, why is Africa poor? And I think that currently it's interesting. He talks a lot about bourgeois scholars and academics who have been trying to answer this question for decades and decades. And the reason that they come up with is rarely imperialism or colonialism. It goes from Africans being unable to self-govern to addressing, like he says, things that are symptoms of the original issue, like corruption or bad governance or lack of institutions, all those things that are symptoms but not the original issue. And I wanted to point out, for example, that when I was in undergrad, we, in our international relations class, talked about something called the resource curse, which for the people at home is this idea that countries or regions that are mineral rich often have lower levels of these indicators of development, so lower economic growth. And it's supposed to be a paradox because it's like, well, if a country has diamonds or has minerals or has uranium, like the Congo, for example, then logic follows that it would be a wealthy country. And I always thought that the idea of the resource curse makes it seem almost magical and fantastical that there are certain countries who are mineral rich, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, who have not been able to benefit from those minerals. But of course, the resource curse doesn't say anything about specifically why they're unable to generate wealth from the minerals that are in their soil. And we'll talk more about why that is later on. But I wanted to get first into the kind of pre-colonial Africa era that Rodney is talking about. And I think he situates us during this time period because he wants to show that Africans were on a certain path of development, going from communalism to feudalism, and that Europeans were on a similar but different path, going from feudalism to the fledglings of capitalism. And I wanted to ask you, so that we can kind of understand the difference between the majority of African societies and the majority of European societies, what kind of communities, what forms of government existed in pre-colonial Africa, and comparatively to the societies that existed in Europe, where were they on the timeline of development?
Yeah, that's a really really good question. You're absolutely right that this is one of the things that Rodney is trying to draw our attention to. First and foremost, right? He is troubling the notion of development and saying that development is really about humanity's capacity to understand the environment that they live in and to develop tools to relate to that environment to their advantage. So for him, development is, do you have science and technology? Do you understand the world that you live in? That's his very simple definition of science. And do you develop tools to live in that world, to make living in that world more easy? That is is technology. By that standard, every society had development. Every society was on this path to further understand the world that they live in and to further develop the tools to make living in that world better. You know, in addition to sort of showing that Africa and Europe were on these similar paths, Rodney is also trying to get us to understand that Africa was 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 a part of 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 an already established and establishing, sorry about that, world. And what I mean by that is that, you know, the types of political organizations, entities that emerge in a particular place have everything to do with the environment of that place and with the needs of those people. So in pre-colonial Africa, I prefer the term ancient Africa, but in ancient Africa, we have large centralized states. We have them in the Niger River Valley. We have them in the Nile River Valley. We have them in the Congo River Valley. We have them in the Zambezi River Valley. These states, right, whether we're talking about old Zimbabwe, the old Kingdom of the Congo, whether we're talking about Mali or Ghana or Songhai or the longest civilization in the world, ancient Egypt, these societies, many of them emerged along these river valleys, extended trade along these river valleys, and they developed this strong centralized states to put larger groups of people in connection and in relationship, and to help facilitate a further long distance of trade, right? We know that African goods in the first century of the Common Era made their way across the Indian Ocean all the way to Asia. We know that by the ninth century of the Common Era, we have gold from West Africa making its way to the Iberian Peninsula to other aspects of Southern Europe. So we have some societies, some large centralized states that are engaged in long distance trade and long distance relationships to other parts of the world. At the same time, other types of polities emerge. A common type of polity was the village polity, a smaller, decentralized form of political organization that still could be involved in long distance trade, but did not require the same level of centralization that, say, a state or a kingdom would require. And what Rodney wants us to see is that these things are differences without values, and that a, large centralized state like the Kingdom of Ghana that emerges is not a higher form of development than a village polity that may have developed in the Sapo rainforest of today's Liberia. That the environments help to facilitate the need for two different types of polities, and one of the things that later European scholars would do would be to sort of read back on these differences and say, well, because there were just a few of the large centralized states, it means that Africa wasn't as developed as Europe. But what we do know is in the pre-colonial or sort of ancient period, there were legal systems, there were universities, there were complex rituals around coronations. There were complex religious traditions and institutions, all to sort of help facilitate a particular African way of life. One other thing before we move on from this, the geography of Africa was much different from the geography of Europe, and this is very important. This is not to romanticize Africa in any way, and that there were warring kingdoms that emerged, but there was less competition for land on the African continent, because there are very few geographic barriers to migration across the African continent. Yes, the topography changes, and yes, in some instances there were sort of more dangerous animals, but over thousands of years, Africans could expand and did expand throughout the entire continent, and there was less competition for control over African land. There was more of it, and that allowed for there to be more diversity to the types of polities that emerged, as opposed to Western Europe, where land was more scarce. And fertile land was even more scarce, and there were many geographic barriers. And so, what Rodney is saying is that one of the other things that happened is that as a part of the historical development of Europe, as a part of this sort of mood from feudalism to early capitalism, we also have the technology that's developing around the competition. And this will come to be very, very critical, that we'll have an economy around war that emerges. And this economy will be used on other people, but it first starts in Europe. And while there are warring states on the African continent, uh, it's less intense because of the geography, because of the space.
Mm-hmm. And in addition to kind of the reasons of geography or topography, in trying to explain the difference between the level of development at the time in Africa and the level of development at the time in Europe, Rodney kind of states that in Europe, there is the emergence of a mercantile class, which will then kind of transform into the capitalist class. And I was wondering if you could speak to any other reasons why these kinds of transformations are happening in Western Europe specifically, by the way, because he does state that Eastern Europe, kind of was struggling in feudalism for much, much longer, but why those kinds of changes are happening across Western Europe, where the mercantile class is rising, where we're beginning to have guilds and the beginnings of capitalism, where there starts to be the need for currency and gold in the economy, which will later kind of be part of the impetus of the transatlantic slave trade and more horrors, but why that process is not happening at the same rate in Africa at the same time.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that's one of the aspect of this work that is more contested and requires uh, more research and more conversation. Um, you know, one of the one of the big debates in world history is really the question of when does capitalism begin, and what role does mercantilism play in the development of capitalism? Is mercantilism a form of capitalism, or is mercantilism sort of separate and distinct from capitalism? But one of the theories here is that the merchants were able to acquire more power than the feudal lords, because of their ability to move around. And as they could move around other parts of Europe, other parts of the world, this just gave them a bit more freedom. And it gave them access to currency, access to wealth that was not dependent on controlling a specific territory or land plot in Europe. But it also meant too that they could develop armies. They could develop militias. They could pose a threat to sort of the existing structure back in Europe
Mm-hmm.
because of their freedom of movement. And I think that was really key. And I think this also is one of the things that we'll see that will complicate European expansion. and again, I want to sort of pause here because, you know, a lot of times we think that European expansion was a neat and straightforward process. And I don't think it was, right? That there were very real contestations against the state and the authority of the state, and the states had to be reconfigured as a result of the expanded power of the merchant class. I mean, I think in many ways we can understand the American Revolution as a sign of that.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, I think that the best way to kind of think about it is that by the practice of their careers, merchants had freedom. They had access to goods to access that allowed them to form new networks of power that could pose a challenge to the old ones.
Mm-hmm. And I think that Rodney also kind of explains that between African and Western European societies specifically, there were areas in which the certain African societies were ahead, but they weren't necessarily the areas that were relevant to the competition. For example, he talks about, you know, the Portuguese being ahead in shipbuilding, and how, you know, in Western Africa, in places like Senegal and Gambia, they had boats that were used for fishing and that were going down the rivers, but the relevant area of operation was the ocean and the seas and having a navy and things like that. So comparatively, it wasn't that Europe was leagues ahead during the pre-colonial period, but in the areas that were going to be relevant for expansion, they had an edge. And I wanted to, as we go into the transatlantic slave trade in the conversation, I wanted to kind of address that, you know, in Europe at the time, there are motivating factors that are causing Europeans to look elsewhere because there's not a lot going on. Where they are. They need minerals, they need more gold for currency, and they don't have it on the European continent, and therefore they need to look elsewhere. What Rodney will then explain is that the small gap that started during the pre-colonial period through the transatlantic slave trade will become an immense gap between the different rates of development of Europe and Africa. And in fact, he is stating very clearly that the rate at which Europe is developing is directly proportional to the rate at which Africa is being underdeveloped. Exactly. And so I wanted to turn our attention to the transatlantic slave trade and ask if you could speak to what impact did the transatlantic slave trade have on African development?
Yeah, I mean, your frame of this is so good. And so before coming into the transatlantic slave trade, let me say one more thing about Europe in the period right before this. And you and you mentioned it, but I want your viewers just to get a sense and think about this. For almost 4 centuries prior to the transatlantic slave trade, Christian Europe had been engaged in a series of wars with the Islamic Mediterranean. This is the Crusades. And again, in world history, we tend to paint the Crusades as just a religious phenomenon. It was not. It was an economic and political phenomenon. And one of the things that happened, even if when the Crusades sort of formally end, in 1453, the Ottoman Turks take control of the key city of Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. This blocks Christian Europe's access to Asia, to these goods that they've come to rely upon, to these resources. And this pushes them to then think about the ocean in ways that Africa is less concerned about. They don't have those same limitations. And this is what sort of Rodney is saying about it being a marginal gap, that while there was some curiosity that we see with Abu Bakari II about the Atlantic Ocean from the Empire of Mali, we don't get the whole the wholesale investment in that in the same way that Europe is doing this. Another thing is happening in Europe. European nation states are emerging. Lords are consolidating their power in Spain and Portugal, and they're becoming kings, right? And they need a basis for that authority, a basis for that power, a basis for that wealth. And so all of this will push people like Isabella and Ferdinand, will push King Alfonso to then say, well, let's use the resources that we do have to invest in the explorers, to invest in the people who are willing to take the chance on the sea. And so this is very important background information to the period before the Atlantic slave trade. And this is also why we can say that that African polities will be surprised by what emerges, right? Because there's a picture that Europe has that I would say that Africa doesn't have. In terms of the transatlantic slave trade, directly, contact with Africa, relatively speaking, in the grand scheme of history, 50, 60 years, is made around the same time as contact with the Americas. This is a part of what gives Western Europe the edge, is that as they're engaging in direct trade and contact with West and West Central Africa, they're also realizing that there are two whole new continents that they did not know about before. I mean, the people who live there, the 100 million people who live there, they knew that they existed, and they were engaged in complex trade networks and building centralized states, but they had not yet engaged directly with Europe. This changes the game. As this fierce competition for resources in Europe continues, as there is this direct engagement with West and West Central Africa, and the realization that there are goods there are people there, and as this realization that there is land that could be used for the taking here in the Americas, these forces come together, and what begins as the mutual exchange between Africans and Europeans, the mutual engagement between Africans and Europeans in the late 1400s and even in the 1500s, rapidly turns towards the acquisition, some buying, but also the kidnapping, the stealing, the promotion of wars to meet a demand for slave labor that's tied directly to the acquisition of American land. And this is key. How do we know this? Well, one of the ways that we know that there was mutuality between Africans and Europeans initially is that there's a document that has survived from 1526 from the King of the Congo, King Alfonso, and he wrote a letter to the King of Portugal. And one of the things he says in this letter has been recorded. Initially, it's written in Portuguese, translated to English. He says, "We didn't establish this relationship for y'all to come and take slaves. We wanted to exchange some goods. We wanted to participate in Catholicism, and we wanted mutuality. But every day, your merchants and men of bad character are taking our sons and daughters of the land, and we wish to have no more trade of the slaves anymore." This is a letter from 1526, before the slave trade takes off. But the king is ignored, and what will happen is that the Kingdom of the Congo will eventually fall because Portuguese slave suppliers will supply weaponry to the opponents of the Kingdom of the Congo, to vassals of the Kingdom of the Congo. The Kingdom of the Congo will eventually be dismantled, and the more powerful kingdoms that emerge will be kingdoms that have emerged in relationship to the slave trade. And this is a big thing that happens on the African continent, is that we have the falling of independent African polities and the emergence of polities that are now subservient to the Atlantic slave trade. And so the impact, I would say, on the African continent will be a loss of African sovereignty. It will be a huge demographic shift, right? We think the numbers are at least somewhere between 11.9 to 12.5 million people. W.B. Du Bois says the number has to be higher because that's just the recorded number. He says as high as 25 million people. And then there's also a break of African, I would say, you know, relationship to our identity and our understanding of ourselves, because so many people every day, many of whom are young, many of whom are vibrant, many of whom are supposed to be the future of the societies that they live in, are being taken. And the more people that are taken, the more wealth that is being generated, and the more wealth that is being generated back to Europe leads for the more development of technology to take more people, and the more development of technology to take more people leads to the taking of more people. And this is the development of Europe that Rodney is talking about. This is the historical process, the 4 centuries of a very organized, very sophisticated violence that primarily serves to produce wealth.
And I wanted to address, questions about Africans' so-called complicity in the transatlantic slave trade, because what Rodney points out is that at the period that Europeans and Africans first have interaction, Europeans are not actually able to take over the African continent. They have, some actions going on the coast especially, but when it comes to the entire continent, they're not going to be able to do that until much later, until the Berlin Conference, until the scramble for Africa. And so when it comes to the kind of different levels of involvement of Africans in the transatlantic slave trade, like you pointed out, there are a lot of different groups that are resisting the transatlantic slave trade. But as certain groups decide to be complicit and they decide to start engaging in slavery as a means of trade, with the Europeans to get, honestly, a lot of garbage, like Rodney points out, that they're getting like second-rate guns, but things that they don't have. They become dependent on that, and it becomes this snowball effect where if your neighbor is trading in slaves, now you need to kind of make that work. And he discusses different historical examples of African groups and civilizations that initially resisted slavery, like the kingdom of Dahomey. He talks about Queen Nzinga. He talks about the Congo, many different groups that attempt to resist the slave trade. But eventually it becomes so ubiquitous that they're unable to resist. For them to resist, it would have had to be that everyone kind of resisted, and at a time where there wasn't political integration across the entire huge African continent, that just wouldn't have been possible. So I just wanted to kind of address that, because as he points out, there's a lot of guilty consciences that have been made because of the slave trade, and sometimes people have tried to kind of make it seem like, well, Africans participated in the sale of their own people, so how can you put this onto the Europeans? But as he very clearly points out, without the Europeans, there wouldn't have been a demand for millions of Africans, and there was, slavery of a different kind that was in, pre-colonial or ancient Africa, as you mentioned. But he states that it was a small amount, that it wasn't necessarily chattel slavery like what we're going to see in the New World. And he really lays out this very interesting, and that's kind of where the Marxist cause and effect is happening, right? Like all the history in the world is a history of transformation, because it's like, okay, boom, boom, boom. What happens? Europe discovers the Americas. They need people to till the land. They need people to work. They tried to use the indigenous people of the Americas, and they were all virtually wiped out by European disease. And so they need those kinds of people who are used to doing agricultural labor. And it just so happens that in the whole of Africa, this is what's happening. It's a basically, feudal period where people are subsistence farming and they're familiar with that. And Europe has the interaction with Africa, and it's the most unhappy coincidence in the history of the world that they have exactly the people that they need to be able to then develop the Americas and use the capital that they then get from developing the Americas to further invest in exploiting the Africas and the people that are then brought to the Americas.
No, I think that's a brilliant summary, and it's something that is often overlooked, especially this idea of African complicity, and I think the question of African complicity is something that still comes up today, and this is a part of why Rodney is trying to say, let's go back to this question of African sovereignty, because what he means by development is really who's in control. And what we see as a result of the Atlantic slave trade is the Atlantic slave trade shifts the dynamics of power. That the strong states that existed before Europe's arrival to the west coast of Africa, they were dismantled or reconfigured. The people who were living in the village polities that I described earlier, they became very, very vulnerable. And it's key to remember that for as much as there was some African participation, there was African resistance. Resistance to the slave trade, abolitionism started on the African continent by the Africans themselves who were first subjected to this. So this is absolutely key. And to the other point that I think you made, a point extremely well taken that we cannot overlook, is the relationship between the land and the labor. Someone had to grow the sugar. Sugar became the most important commodity in the world, a commodity that made Europe rich. This is what he's talking about. Mm-hmm. And as someone from the Caribbean, he knew that. And this is why European powers initially, before the scramble for Africa, there was the scramble for the Caribbean. European powers were fighting to the teeth for control of those tropical islands, for their ability to grow sugar. Mm-hmm. And people died by the millions in that process, working people to death. Historians have now given us insight into the process by which sugar was produced, how terrible the conditions were to make that happen. But there was a scramble for that sugar, first in the Caribbean, and for Africans to grow that sugar. Later came tobacco and cotton and indigo. But initially it was sugar. And it's that excess, that wealth that's flowing across the Atlantic back to Europe, that's building castles, that's supporting armies, that's allowing for the development of specialization of labor, and that will eventually, as Rodney says, lead to the development of warehouses, manufacturing, the ability to produce goods. Will move people then in Europe from the countryside to the cities. Now we have the development of cities, and by the 19th century, slavery will become obsolete as a form of economic system. And now, instead of needing millions of people to go somewhere else to work American land or the land of the Americas, well, now we need them to stay right here in Africa to get the resources to supply the industries of Europe. And that's that relationship between slavery and development that Rodney wants us to see. And that will then lead to the scramble for Africa that you referenced.
Absolutely. And I think that as we wind down here and look at the Berlin Conference and the colonial period, what is going to happen is that the intensification of the exploitation, it's only going to increase with time. And essentially what is happening is that the United States is benefiting from African labor to an extent that cannot be kind of undermined. Because of World War II, the European countries are out of the race, basically. They are
And put out the race by the U.S.
exactly. They're struggling in order to rebuild. And Rodney really, what he does in this book is that he situates Africa in the middle of world history, because the United States is becoming a world power in part due to African labor, due to slavery. The European powers are able to rise and able to develop, able to create the social systems to then appease the European worker who otherwise perhaps would revolt, but they're taking, what they are not giving to the African worker, they're giving to the European worker in the form of higher wages, in the form of social services, and the African worker is just being left to the dust. He talks about some of the horrible conditions that the African workers during colonialism are experiencing in the mines, doing horrible work that the European workers are also being exploited, but they are definitely experiencing better conditions, than the African worker. And what Rodney is saying overall is that without African labor, without African capital, without African minerals, Europe and the United States would be nothing.
Yeah.
Would be nothing.
No, I mean, we have to do a part two of this because
100%.
then he lays out, how that history of slavery then turns into a history of post-slavery, of anti-slavery,
Right.
but it doesn't end up being a different economic arrangement. It's a different political arrangement, and Africans, whether in the Americas or on the continent of Africa, may have a different legal status. But for Rodney, the economic arrangement that began in 1501, the economic arrangement that Nzinga Mbemba was talking about, that economic arrangement, that continued, Rodney said, up until 1972 when he wrote.
Yeah.
And I would say it continues even
2025,
even
I
today,
fear.
even today. And I think this is why this work is so relevant, because Rodney wants us to see that if we think that the political, that the legal, that the naming of these categories such as slavery or the illegal slavery, if we only focus on the cruelty, if we only focus on the violence, if we only focus on the 1808 the British abolished slavery, 1865 the Americans abolished slavery, and if we only focus on that, he says what we will miss is how the world still actually works. Right? And for those people interested in contemporary Africa, and remember, this is what he says in the preface. He says it's a history book, but really it's a book about the contemporary situation of Africa. I'm only going into the past so that y'all can understand that. And for him, the contemporary situation is, well, this is the same economic arrangement that started. And unless that economic arrangement breaks, this is going to be the relationship between Europe and Africa and the Americans. I want to say one more point. I know we're at time. But, this idea that Europe's wealth and the U.S.'s wealth is tied to African labor and African land, this is key. And for those people interested in understanding geopolitics, this is absolutely key. And at a time that we're living in today, this is absolutely key. And this is why I think Rodney remains a conversation partner to us, because of this brilliant insight that he had to offer, really to sort of warn us against this moment, to warn African leaders to say, look, if you get political independence, but it's not tied to economic independence, then you don't really have independence at all. And I think that's a part of the legacy of this book. And I think people interested in independence, true independence, should re-engage with this work and build on what he started doing.
Absolutely. And with that, we will come to a close because we are at time. Thank you so much, Professor, for coming and speaking to me about this book for the second time.
Yeah, and I'll come do it for the third time.
Yes, because there's a lot more that we didn't cover. We didn't talk about the colonial period, and I would love to have another conversation about that. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me.
This has been The Archive. Subscribe to the channel if you liked this video, and always remember that a better world is possible. Goodbye. All right, how do we do this? He's gonna come like.
Yeah, cool.
Dude, that went so fast.
Yeah, it did.